Picture this. It's May 1940. Nazi Germany has just conquered France in 6 weeks. Britain stands alone against Hitler's war machine. The British army is trapped on the beaches of Dunkirk, about to be annihilated. Most of Churchill's own cabinet wants to negotiate peace with Hitler. The king has doubts. Even Churchill's friends think he's leading Britain to certain destruction. And in that darkest moment, Winston Churchill makes a decision that will change the course of human history. He refuses to surrender. But here's the shocking part. Just days earlier, many in Parliament didn't even want him as Prime Minister. He was considered too reckless, too unpredictable, too dangerous. So how did this flawed, controversial man become the greatest wartime leader of the 20th century? Today, we're diving deep into the extraordinary life of Winston Churchill, a story filled with failure, redemption, and one man's refusal to give up when all hope seemed lost. I'm your host, and this is the story of the man who saved Britain. Winston Leonard Spencer Churchill was born on November 30th, 1874, into one of Britain's most aristocratic families. His father, Lord Randolph Churchill, was a prominent politician. His mother, Jenny Jerome, was a beautiful American socialite. You'd think this would be a privileged, happy childhood. You'd be wrong. Young Winston was essentially neglected by his parents. His father barely spoke to him and considered him a disappointment. His mother was too busy with London society to pay him much attention. The only person who truly loved him was his nanny, Mrs. Everest. Years later, Churchill would say she was his best friend in the world. At boarding school, Winston was a terrible student. He was rebellious, hated authority, and finished nearly last in his class. But here's what's fascinating. He wasn't stupid. Far from it. He simply refused to learn things that didn't interest him. He loved history and English, but despised mathematics and Latin. This stubborn independence would define his entire life. After failing the entrance exam to the Royal Military Academy at Sandhurst twice, he finally got in on his 3rd attempt. But even then, he could only qualify for the cavalry because his grades weren't good enough for the infantry. His father was ashamed. He told Winston he'd amount to nothing more than a social wastrel. But something was burning inside young Churchill. He craved glory, adventure, and recognition. After graduating from Sandhurst, he didn't just want to be a soldier. He wanted to be where the action was. So he did something extraordinary. He used his mother's social connections to get himself assigned to conflicts around the world. At just 21 years old, Churchill went to Cuba to observe their War of Independence, then to India's northwest frontier, then to Sudan, where he participated in the last great cavalry charge in British military history at the Battle of Omdurman. But he didn't just fight, he wrote. He sent dispatches to London newspapers, earning money and fame as a war correspondent. His writing was brilliant, vivid, and dramatic. The public loved it. Churchill was becoming famous. But he wanted more. He wanted political power. In 1900, at just 25 years old, Churchill was elected to Parliament. He was the youngest member of the House of Commons. Ambitious, brilliant, but also arrogant and often insufferable. Many politicians couldn't stand him. Churchill's early political career was marked by controversy. He switched parties not once, but twice. First, he left the Conservative Party to join the Liberals over free trade. His own party called him a traitor. Years later, he'd switch back. This party hopping earned him deep distrust from both sides. But Churchill had genuine talent. He became First Lord of the Admiralty in 1911, responsible for the Royal Navy. When World War I broke out in 1914, Churchill was in his element. He was energetic, creative, and full of bold ideas. Perhaps too bold. In 1915, Churchill championed a naval attack on the Dardanelles and Gallipoli in Turkey. The plan was to knock the Ottoman Empire out of the war and open a new front against Germany. On paper, it was brilliant. In execution, it was a catastrophe. The campaign was a disaster. Tens of thousands of Allied soldiers died. Churchill was blamed. He was forced to resign from the Admiralty in humiliation. His political career seemed over. He was 40 years old and considered washed up. Churchill was devastated. He fell into depression, what he called his black dog. But instead of giving up, he did something remarkable. He volunteered to serve as a soldier on the Western Front in France. He commanded a battalion in the trenches, sharing the danger with ordinary soldiers. Eventually, Churchill clawed his way back into politics. Through the 1920s and 1930s, he held various positions, but he was increasingly seen as a relic out of touch with modern times. He opposed giving India independence. He opposed Edward VIII abdication. He seemed to be on the wrong side of every issue. But there was one issue where Churchill was absolutely, prophetically right: Nazi Germany. Throughout the 1930s, while most British politicians pursued appeasement with Hitler, Churchill warned that Nazi Germany was rearming and preparing for war. He gave speech after speech in Parliament, warning that Britain needed to build up its military, particularly its air force. People thought he was a warmonger, stuck in the past, trying to relive the glory days of empire. Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain pursued a policy of appeasement, trying to satisfy Hitler's demands to avoid war. In 1938, Chamberlain signed the Munich Agreement, giving Czechoslovakia to Hitler in exchange for a promise of peace. Chamberlain returned to London declaring, "Peace for our time." The crowds cheered. Churchill was almost alone in Parliament when he stood up and said, "You were given a choice between war and dishonor. You chose dishonor, and you will have war." He was right. In September 1939, Hitler invaded Poland. Britain declared war. The Second World War had begun. Chamberlain brought Churchill back into government as First Lord of the Admiralty, the same position he'd held in World War I. Churchill was back, and the Royal Navy signaled to its fleet worldwide, "Winston is back." But the war went badly. Germany conquered Poland. Then in April 1940, they invaded Norway. The British tried to intervene and failed. The government was in crisis. Parliament had lost confidence in Chamberlain. Britain needed a new leader. But here's the shocking thing. Almost nobody wanted Churchill. King George VI didn't want him. Most of the Conservative Party didn't want him. Even many in his own party preferred Lord Halifax, the Foreign Secretary. But Halifax didn't want the job. He thought the war was already lost. So on May 10, 1940, Winston Churchill, at 65 years old, became Prime Minister. That same day, Hitler launched his invasion of France and the Low Countries. Churchill's timing couldn't have been worse or more necessary. The situation Churchill inherited was catastrophic. Within weeks, the German army smashed through France. The supposedly invincible French military collapsed. The British army was trapped on the beaches of Dunkirk with their backs to the sea, about to be annihilated. Churchill's war cabinet met in crisis. Lord Halifax and others argued that Britain should negotiate with Hitler through Mussolini. They thought the war was lost. Better make peace now, while Britain still had something to bargain with. Churchill refused. He gave a speech to the full cabinet, about 25 ministers. He told them that nations that went down fighting rose again, but those that surrendered were finished. One minister later wrote that Churchill's words were so inspiring that everyone wanted to rush out of the room and fight the Germans themselves. Then came the miracle of Dunkirk. Between May 26 and June 4, 1940, over 338,000 Allied soldiers were evacuated from the beaches by a combination of Royal Navy warships and hundreds of civilian boats, fishing vessels, pleasure yachts, anything that could float. It was a defeat turned into a kind of victory through sheer determination. Churchill went before Parliament and gave one of history's most famous speeches. He said, "We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender." The words electrified Britain. Even those who had doubted Churchill began to believe. Maybe, just maybe, Britain could survive. But Churchill wasn't just giving speeches. He was working 16-hour days, meeting with generals, planning strategy, visiting bomb cities, personally overseeing every aspect of the war effort. He drove his staff to exhaustion. He could be demanding, temperamental, and difficult, but he was also inspiring, courageous, and utterly determined. France surrendered in June 1940. Britain stood alone against Nazi Germany. Hitler controlled Europe from the Atlantic to Poland. Britain was isolated, outnumbered, and facing an invasion. The Battle of Britain began. The German Luftwaffe attempted to destroy the Royal Air Force as a prelude to invasion. Every day, young British pilots took to the skies in their Spitfires and Hurricanes to fight waves of German bombers and fighters. Churchill visited the RAF command centers, watching the battle unfold on plotting tables. The fate of Britain hung on a few hundred young pilots. Churchill later said of them, "Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few." The RAF won. By October 1940, Hitler postponed the invasion indefinitely. Britain had survived. But then came the Blitz. For months, German bombers pounded British cities night after night. London, Coventry, Liverpool, Birmingham. Civilians died by the thousands. Buildings were reduced to rubble. But the British people didn't break. Churchill walked through the bombed streets, visited shelters, and wept with victims who had lost everything. His presence meant everything. When people saw him, with his signature cigar and his V for Victory sign, they felt they could endure anything. But Churchill knew Britain couldn't win alone. He needed America. President Franklin Roosevelt was sympathetic, but couldn't bring America into the war. Not yet. So Churchill wrote letters, gave speeches broadcast of America, and cultivated his relationship with Roosevelt. In December 1941, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. America entered the war. Churchill later wrote that he went to bed that night and slept soundly for the first time in 2 years. He knew Britain would win now. Churchill immediately traveled to Washington. For 3 weeks, he lived at the White House, meeting with Roosevelt daily. The two men formed a partnership that would last through the war. They weren't always in agreement, far from it, but they worked together to defeat Hitler. The next years were filled with strategic decisions. Where to attack, when to open a second front, how to deal with Stalin and the Soviet Union. Churchill was at the center of it all, attending conferences in Casablanca, Tehran, and Yalta. Some of Churchill's decisions were controversial. The bombing of German cities killed hundreds of thousands of civilians. Churchill authorized ruthless actions in the name of victory. He wasn't a saint. He was a wartime leader doing whatever he believed necessary to win. But his leadership was crucial. His speeches kept British morale high. His relationship with Roosevelt kept America engaged. His complex management of Stalin kept the Soviet Union fighting on the Eastern Front. On May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered. The war in Europe was over. Churchill appeared on the balcony of Buckingham Palace with the royal family. Massive crowds celebrated in the streets. Churchill gave a V for Victory sign and said, "This is your victory." The crowd roared back, "No, it is yours." Churchill had saved Britain. He had led his nation from the brink of destruction to complete victory. He was the most famous man in the world, hailed as the greatest leader of the age. 2 months later, Britain held its first election in a decade. Everyone assumed Churchill would win in a landslide. He'd won the war. Surely the British people would give him a mandate to win the peace. He lost. The Labour Party won a massive victory. Churchill was out of office. He was shocked. His wife Clementine tried to console him, saying it might be a blessing in disguise. Churchill replied, "At the moment, it's very well disguised." Why did the British people reject their war hero? The answer is complicated. Churchill was a brilliant war leader, but the public wanted change. They wanted social reform, a welfare state, a new Britain. Churchill represented the old guard, the empire, traditional values. The people wanted to move forward. Churchill spent 6 years in opposition, but he wasn't idle. He wrote. His 6-volume history, The Second World War, became an international bestseller and won him the Nobel Prize in Literature. He gave his famous Iron Curtain speech in 1946, warning about Soviet expansion. Once again, Churchill was prophetic about the threat to freedom. In 1951, Churchill became prime minister again at age 76. But this second term was different. He was old, tired, and not the force he'd once been. He suffered a stroke in 1953 that was hidden from the public. He held on to power perhaps longer than he should have. Finally, in 1955, Churchill resigned. He remained a member of Parliament until 1964, but he was fading. He spent his final years painting, a hobby he'd taken up during his darkest days after Gallipoli. He said painting helped him with his depression, his black dog. Winston Churchill died on January 24th, 1965, at age 90. He was given a state funeral, the first for a non-royal in over a century. Hundreds of thousands lined the streets of London as his coffin passed. Leaders from around the world attended. It was the end of an era. So, who was Winston Churchill really? The answer is complicated, and that's what makes him so fascinating. He was a hero who saved Western civilization from Nazi tyranny. Without Churchill's leadership in 1940, Britain likely would have made peace with Hitler. The entire course of World War II would have been different. The Holocaust might have succeeded completely. Soviet communism might have dominated all of Europe. The world we live in exists partly because Churchill refused to surrender. But he was also a man of his time, with views that seem deeply problematic today. He believed in the British Empire and resisted decolonization. He made racist comments about Indians and other colonized peoples. He bore responsibility for the Bengal famine of 1943, in which millions died. He opposed social reforms and workers' rights for much of his career. Churchill was complex, a brilliant strategist and an inspirational leader, but also stubborn, difficult, and often wrong about domestic policy. He suffered from depression throughout his life, battled alcoholism, and had a volatile temperament that made him hard to work with. He failed repeatedly before his greatest triumph. He was 65 when he became Prime Minister in Britain's darkest hour. Everything in his life, the military adventures, the political setbacks, the wilderness years of the 1930s, had prepared him for that moment. Churchill himself understood his destiny. He once said, "I felt as if I were walking with destiny, and that all my past life had been but a preparation for this hour and for this trial." What can we learn from Winston Churchill's life? First, failure isn't final. Churchill failed spectacularly at Gallipoli. He was politically isolated for years. Most people would have given up, but he kept going, kept fighting, and when his moment came, he was ready. Second, being right isn't enough. You have to persist. Churchill warned about Hitler for years when nobody wanted to listen. He was mocked, ignored, and sidelined, but he never stopped warning, and eventually, history proved him right. Third, words matter. Churchill's speeches in 1940 genuinely changed history. His ability to articulate what Britain was fighting for, to give people hope when all seemed lost, was as important as any military strategy. Fourth, leadership means making hard decisions. Churchill authorized actions that resulted in civilian deaths. He made compromises with Stalin that abandoned Eastern Europe to communism. Leadership in crisis means choosing between bad options and living with the consequences. Fifth, embrace your flaws while working on them. Churchill knew he had a black dog depression. He knew he drank too much, worked too obsessively, and could be impossible to deal with. But he didn't let his flaws define him. He found ways to cope, painting, writing, the support of his wife Clementine, and channeled his energy toward his purpose. So here's my question for you. Churchill said, "Success is not final. Failure is not fatal. It is a courage to continue that counts." When have you faced your own darkest hour? When did you ever decide whether to surrender or keep fighting? And what would you have done if you were in Churchill's position in May 1940, with your own cabinet telling you the war was lost? Think about that. And remember, we're all walking with our own destiny. Sometimes we just don't know it yet. If you enjoyed this deep dive into Winston Churchill's extraordinary life, please subscribe to our channel. We explore the fascinating, complicated stories of history's most influential figures, the triumphs, the failures, and everything in between. Hit that subscribe button, ring the notification bell, and let me know in the comments, who should we cover next? What historical figure's story are you dying to hear? Thanks for listening, and remember,